Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 72 of the Near Memo. And David Mem is out this week, so it's just me and Mike Blumenthal here to talk about search, social, and commerce through a local lens. And this week, we kind of have a special edition. We decided we were going to unpack the two big pieces of legislation that were ratified this past week. It may have been at the end of last week, actually, in Europe, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which are two very, very sweeping and significant pieces of legislation, which will change how all the big tech companies and many companies in general operate in the European digital environment. And they potentially have repercussions for the US market as well. Although there's legislation pending, antitrust legislation pending, which may or may not ever make it out of Congress, depending upon what happens over the next couple of months. So we decided to focus in on these two acts because they are very significant, and it kind of comes on the heels of Mike's excellent piece about what would happen in the U.S. if Google was forced to stop self-preferencing around Google Maps and the local pack. And so there's some similar issues there in Europe. So, Mike, anything you want to say in general before we dive in?
Let's just dive.
Okay, so we're gonna go into the Digital Markets Act first, and then we'll talk about the Digital Services Act after that. Many people may have some familiarity. We have some people in Europe that listen and subscribe to the newsletter, so those folks are probably quite a bit more familiar with than many people in North America. But for those that are unaware, you can sort of broadly think about the DMA and the DSA as B2B and B2C. The DMA is really focused on competition and quote unquote leveling the playing field against these big gatekeepers, and the DSA is really about how consumers interact with content and how and the platforms that publish it. So first, the DMA, and I'm just going to rattle off some very high level provisions, and then Mike, you can fill in the blanks if I leave anything out. So the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, is going to ban practices used by large so-called gatekeepers, Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and there'll be an enforcement mechanism, which we'll talk about. But it's directed almost exclusively at very large companies, and I believe the user threshold is 45 million users and above.
45 million users in the EU, which is 10% of the EU population.
Right. And then it will, so that's fundamentally different than the DSA, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Pertains to large companies. It will ban self-preferencing or favoring of a company's own products and services. So Amazon favoring the I forget what their white label product is called. Amazon Essentials, is that what it's called? I forget what it's called. So something like Amazon favoring its own white label brands, or in the case of Google's hypothetically putting a map at the top of search results, which we've talked about in the past. It also requires the big platforms to allow businesses to transact, i.e. subscriptions or in-app payments, off the App Store, to take them out of the sort of 30% payment toll, or 15% in some cases. So you'll have to, they can't block people directing users to other places to pay. I think it opens up alternative app stores, the creation of alternative app stores. It requires interoperability between messaging platforms. So iMessage and WhatsApp and so on and so forth. And it allows people it prevents platforms from blocking the removal of pre-installed software. So it gives people more control over what's on their phones in particular. Mike, did I leave anything significant out?
Just a couple things. Gatekeepers are people who are market makers with this large presence, but also potential market makers. And they noted that they may identify as many as 10 to 15 of them in total. who the smaller ones being in the role of emerging gatekeepers. Also, there's a significant fine of 6% of
Yes.
10% of annual global turnover if a violation is determined. So it's a pretty big hit. It's not pocket change to these folks.
Right. So yeah. So in that's right. So that's 10%. DMA is 6%. DMA is 10%. DSA is 6%.
Right.
In Google's case, that would be 25 billion, and in Facebook's case, it would be something like 11 billion.
Right.
10% of global revenues. So those are some big teeth from an enforcement standpoint. Although
And
yeah, go ahead.
just that it's a regulation that will be managed by a commission task force with 80 officials and about $12 million for additional experts to help investigate and manage compliance or investigate compliance enforcement over a 4-year period. So there's a regulation in place which replaces apparently 27 in the EU, 27 different current regulatory environments. So on the one hand, it seems to the US's eye as a radical piece of legislation, but to a company doing business in Europe having to deal with 27 different regulatory bodies, in some ways it makes it easier for both bigger and smaller companies to wrap their heads around what the regulations actually are.
Right. That's the arguable silver lining in a otherwise relatively strict regime, which these big tech companies had lobbied against. And it's worth noting that many of the features of the DMA and the DSA are present in U.S. antitrust um legislation that's pending. They're not identical, but there's a Venn diagram overlap in many of these cases. Um, so let's
And
yeah.
one presumes that these large companies would favor a consistent regulatory environment worldwide. The likes of Google and Facebook don't like having to change things for one area of the world. So in some senses, this is, and they are better able to change things, but they don't like it either. So in some senses, it will serve them. A couple of questions though, or comments. One is on messaging. Does messaging interoperability, usually interoperability is lowest common denominator. So take iMessage. Right now, it can interact with Google Messaging, or say whatever it's called, whatever Google named it this month, through SMS, which is a very low common denominator. But is that enough interoperability, or will it require more? Do I have to give blue bubbles or reply features or
God
thumbs
forbid.
up features?
That's the competitive advantage. Green versus
So
blue.
there's that question. And in terms of self-preferencing,
Well,
to
wait. Let's
me,
before we move
oh,
on to self-preferencing, which I think is a really important and interesting topic. Just on this
okay,
interoperability point, the larger point that you raise, I think, is really valid and important. A lot of the details I don't think are present. So this idea of how do you define interoperability? What's required? Is it this lowest common denominator approach, or is there something more? I think that point pertains to a lot of these provisions. There's going to be gray areas. There's going to be ambiguity, and I think it's going to play out over time, and in many cases, perhaps in an enforcement context. So going in, there'll be some attempt to comply, and many of those attempts, I think, will prove to be insufficient, and then there'll have to be adjustments after the fact. But let's go on to self-preferencing, because I think from our point of view, that's a really super interesting and important topic, of course, that you just wrote about last week.
right. In a B2B sense, self-preferencing hurts the likes of companies like Yelp because Google puts their local results above Yelp's. There is an interesting contradiction there too, though. If they are putting small business results above Yelp's and helping small businesses with greater visibility,
Is that self-preferencing?
exactly. So in other words, Google is making an editorial decision to favor small businesses directly rather than forcing a user to go to Yelp to see ads and then find a small business.
And
S-
that really pertains to all kinds of verticals, right? Hotels,
yes,
home services, all of these vertical directories that have an interest in trying to get traffic, acquire traffic, and then show ads or whatever their business model is. Uh, there's that you've hit on, I think, the fundamental tension in this program, which is Google's local pack is being seen as a Google product, and to some degree it is. But as we discussed, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, if Google were simply to remove the map and put just local business information, essentially keeping the local pack intact, but not sending people to the Google business profile, would that sufficiently address self-preferencing? And then it gets into this question of the directories versus the businesses themselves. I mean, I think it's really kind of a thorny and difficult issue.
yeah. I mean, to some people, directories are a middleman, a rentier, so to speak, who
Yep.
is looking to arbitrage the market for profit, as opposed to Google,
That's
who's looking to arbitrage the market for profit. I mean, it's just a question of where you draw the lines. And clearly, Yelp has been very influential in forming U.S. and perhaps international policy in this matter. I don't perceive their user experience all that great. Sorry to say, Yelp,
Well, all these
but
directories would argue they have value added features, right? RFPs in
mm-hmm,
Yelp's case, or reviews, as the case may be, which Google also has, of course. So, but I think this is a situation where Google is going to be compelled to try a number of approaches, and then see what happens, see what the enforcers, what the bureaucrats say. And there is this concern that was raised in a Reuters article about whether or not the 60 or 80 people that you referred to is going to be sufficient to do all the enforcement that's going to be called for. But putting that
right.
aside, I mean, I think um, Google has tried. We've seen a preview of this in the past when Google was trying to avoid antitrust penalties way back when. They they had an approach called rival links, where they put essentially in a carousel. I don't even remember what the pages look like. They put alternative directories to their own content up, um, and people had objections to it and didn't like it for various reasons. But we've seen little experiments in the past that may preview some new approach that they take. But I'm going to bet that Google is going to modify the existing local pack and remove the Google branded features of that as a first effort here, and see what happens. We'll see.
Hard to know. The other part of that self-preferencing is around pre-installed software and
Yep.
apps. The rules will prevent companies from having those removed or forcing them to be installed. I'm not sure which. But then you run into an interesting question, for example, on Safari on the iPhone. Apple has a rule that all web browsers have to use WebKit as their core technology, and then they can change the
Yeah.
UI, which they claim is around privacy and security and their ability to control that, because web browsers open up a whole new vector for attacks. So there's this tension there, even though you may get innovative web browser products using different browser engines. Apple has decided to limit the choice in browser engines, but to allow other browser interfaces. So are they going after that, for example?
I
And
think
what will that mean?
Yeah, so I think that that's going to be an issue that comes up because it's a known issue. Obviously, people are frustrated by it. So I think that that's something that the European Commission and the legislators that drafted this probably didn't. There are many issues that probably didn't get addressed or thought through entirely, and I think that will arise because that does seem like Apple using its competitive leverage to shape the market. And so I think that inevitably will be a question, and somebody will have to adjudicate or to make a determination about that. And you've got, I mean, you raised this in a couple of different contexts. You've got this balancing of interests, um, you know, competition versus security and privacy, the interests of businesses versus directories. and intermediaries that are smaller than Google. I mean, I think there's going to be a lot of these trade-offs and tensions that play out as this legislation is enacted or these rules are enacted.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.